Located in north-central Poland, there's a village called Górna Grupa. It's a small, peaceful place with less than 500 inhabitants. The most recognisable feature in Górna Grupa is the monastery, a large, majestic building that is home to the Verbite word missionaries. Despite this tranquil setting and the presence of these men of God, the building itself has a very dark reputation. The monastery has a long and interesting history. It was originally constructed as a palace for the von Bismarck family, but shortly after the First World War the building was destroyed in a fire. The Verbite order acquired the ruins along with the surrounding land, and they began a comprehensive reconstruction and expansion project, turning it into a monastery. Until 1939, the monastery served as both the Verbite order's headquarters and as a school which housed over 300 people. In the autumn of 1939, with the onset of Nazi occupation, the monastery fell under the control of German forces. The missionaries that lived there faced either deportation to concentration camps or execution in the nearby forests. Just 3 kilometers from the monastery, mass graves containing nearly 10,000 victims were uncovered. Among the dead were numerous Verbite missionaries. Shortly after the end of the Second World War, the surviving missionaries returned to Górna Grupa, only to find that the monastery was once again in ruins. Undeterred, they set about rebuilding it once more. However, it wasn't long before Poland fell under communist rule, and the regime often found itself in conflict with religious faith. As a result, on the 3rd of July 1952, the state confiscated the land from the missionaries and turned the monastery into a hospital for the mentally ill. That very same day, workmen arrived and they began making significant alterations to the monastery's interior, which included removing some of the internal walls and constructing new ones, dividing the space into smaller rooms. Metal bars were installed on the windows and several emergency exits were sealed off. As a result of these modifications, each floor only had a single stairwell that served as its exit point. Part of the building was also designated as living quarters for the hospital staff and their families. This area was separated from the hospital wing by a newly built wall. None of these modifications were recorded on the building's blueprints, nor was anybody officially informed about the interior changes. During construction, many corners were cut in order to save money. For example, the insulation in the old walls and ceilings was made from dry straw and pine needles. This was supposed to be replaced with modern high-quality materials. Also, the wooden ceilings were supposed to be replaced with a non-flammable material. Like many other things, these modifications were just never implemented. Over the years, there were numerous safety inspections which highlighted these flaws, yet due to a lack of funds, materials and the general inefficiency of the system, it made it pretty much impossible to carry out any renovation works. The staff knew about these problems too. One of the doctors that worked at the hospital would later state that their biggest fault was agreeing to work under such conditions without at least attempting to voice their concerns. During this time in Poland, these kind of conditions were considered quite normal. Due to a scarcity of resources, people had an attitude of just getting by, improvising if they didn't have what they needed. Getting any kind of support from the government was almost impossible, except when projects were deemed crucial to the state's functioning. This meant that the hospital staff had to get a bit creative in many aspects of their daily operations. For example, one strange thing that happened in the hospital was that the light switches on the wall would go missing. The reason for their disappearance, or who was taking them, always remained a mystery. Often a nurse would go to turn the lights on, only to find the exposed wires hanging out of the wall where the switch should have been. Over time, the hospital staff got so used to this that they would just turn the lights on without a switch, learning to cross and uncross the exposed wires without getting electrocuted. This lack of funds also meant that there wasn't any proper training of personnel, particularly when it came to managing aggressive patients. At the time, these kind of training programs were non-existent, so staff were forced to devise their own ways of dealing with problem patients. As a consequence, staff often found themselves with no choice but to bend or break the rules. Shortly after the hospital opened, it became extremely overcrowded, with rooms literally being filled past their capacity. Patients with milder conditions were housed on the ground floor. The first floor housed the administration offices. Above those was the second and third floors, which were allocated to the most severe cases. The ones on the third floor would rarely even leave their rooms, often spending days in bed staring at the ceiling. The rooms were so overcrowded that there was only space for beds, there was no additional furniture. Often there wasn't enough room to walk in between the beds. In some rooms, accessing certain spots required jumping or crawling over other patients' beds. Whilst this might sound terrible, especially when you hear what happens next, it's important to consider that the hospital in Górna Grupa was pretty good compared to some of the other places in the country. In fact, some nurses said that it was one of the best places they had ever worked. Accounts indicate that the medical staff did try to improve the patients' lives as best they could. Nurses occasionally brought in homemade cakes and pies to share with the patients, but generally the patients' experience day to day was still quite miserable. The rooms, as well as being extremely overpopulated, were dirty and smelled very bad. Toilets were available but only for the staff. Patients were forced to use metal buckets which were then emptied outside. Metal bars on the windows meant that they couldn't be opened very far, which made ventilation extremely poor. It meant that in the summer, the tightly packed rooms were unbearably hot. During one routine inspection, the inspector saw a row of patients dressed in dirty gowns lying on the floor or propped up along the wall of a corridor like broken dolls. These people displayed some of the most severe cases of mental illness, being unable to communicate and being completely dependent on the nurses. When questioned about the patient's conditions, it was explained to him that there was simply not enough staff to deal with them all, so they were just kind of left there all day long. And so hospital life continued on for a few decades. That was until the evening of October the 31st, 1980. The hospital was preparing to settle down for the night. By this point they had 319 patients, but they only had 4 nurses. These nurses were responsible for overseeing the entire hospital, and 3 of them were very inexperienced, having only graduated from medical school a few months previously, and this being their first job in the field. As a result, in order to keep the more difficult patients under control, some of the rooms on the upper floors had to be locked overnight, and some patients, especially those on the top floor, were tied to their beds. Due to this lack of staffing, on the overnight shifts, the nurses would pick a trustworthy patient and give them the responsibility of watching over the others on the 3rd floor. Shortly before 11 PM, this one trustworthy patient, a man who was nicknamed Ali, rushed into the nurses' station just as the women were preparing a meal. Ali was in an extreme panic. He reported that there was a fire in the building. The thing is, Ali was a known pyromaniac and he had a history of raising false alarms. The nurses just assumed that he was making it up. They managed to calm him down and sent him back upstairs so that they could continue making their meal. Unfortunately, this time it wasn't a false alarm. The fire was very real. Shortly after Ali was sent upstairs, the nurses noticed the smell of smoke. Around the same time, the lights in the hospital began to flicker. Andrzej Rakowski, the building's caretaker, went outside to check the fuses and possibly to start the emergency generators. Given the troubles that plagued the country at the time, it wasn't unusual for the electrics to suddenly be cut off. However, when he went outside, he heard one of the nurses yelling from the window, telling him that the building was on fire. The nurses were inside on the upper floors, desperately trying to get into the locked rooms where the patients were trapped, but the corridors were already filling up with choking black smoke. They tried to open the windows to ventilate the area, but the metal bars only allowed the windows to open a tiny gap. Despite their best intentions, the smoke became too thick. The nurses were pushed back and prevented from reaching the locked rooms where the panicking patients were trapped inside. Meanwhile, on the ground floor, the patients who hadn't been locked into their rooms for the night started to become anxious and began wandering around the building trying to investigate. The situation quickly became extremely chaotic and hard to control. By this point, due to the heavy smoke, it wasn't possible to reach the upper floors of the hospital through the main stairwell. The caretaker called for firefighters, and then he ran over to the residential side of the building. Rakowski recalled one of his family members once telling him that there used to be a fire exit in the residential building, but it had been blocked by a new wall being built. He grabbed a pickaxe and began trying to knock a hole through that wall. At that moment, 6 firefighters arrived on the scene. They swiftly entered the premises, only to encounter the solid brick wall in the exact location where the blueprints indicated that an emergency exit should have been. They wasted precious time trying to find another way in. Eventually they found the main stairwell, but they quickly realized that their oxygen masks weren't sufficient to protect them from the smoke. They eventually realized that the only way into the building would be through the hole that the caretaker was trying to knock in the brick wall, so they joined in, trying to knock through the wall with pickaxes. By this time, the entire roof of the hospital was ablaze. Eventually, though, they managed to breach the wall, and immediately thick black smoke began to pour out. The sounds from inside were horrific. They could hear people screaming in agony. They tried to get through, but the intense heat made it impossible to enter through the hole. Meanwhile, additional firefighting units from neighbouring towns began to arrive on the scene. Ambulances and military reservists were also directed to the area. However, the path that the vehicles had to take was extremely overgrown with trees and bushes. This meant that the servicemen had to waste precious time cutting it back to clear the way. Eventually, though, the firefighters got to the hospital and they swiftly set about connecting their fire hoses to the hydrant. But when they aimed the hoses at the hospital roof and turned the water on, nothing happened. They soon discovered that due to the years of neglect, the fire hydrants just didn't work anymore. With the fire growing ever stronger, the firefighters were forced to implement some desperate measures. They decided to throw their water pumps into a nearby pond, but before they could even do that, they had to spend a lot of time removing a layer of dead leaves from the pond's surface to stop their pumps from getting clogged up. Even that didn't help. The pond was so muddy that the pumps began to get clogged up anyway. This meant that the firefighters had to stop every few minutes and unclog the pumps before they could begin again. One firefighter would later say, "Whenever the stream of water directed at the fire weakened, the flames seemed to erupt with double force." It quickly became apparent that using that swampy pond water to try and extinguish the fire was completely futile. They had no choice but to wait for the arrival of tanker trucks from nearby cities. Despite the numerous setbacks, an evacuation began in full swing. Soldiers and firefighters went into the areas of the hospital that they could access and began pulling patients out. One firefighter later said, "Such cruelty. Those people probably weren't even thinking rationally. Some of them might not even have known that they were alive, and they had to be searched for by groping around, guided by some squeaking, moaning." To their surprise, the rescuers encountered fierce resistance from many of the patients that they were trying to save. Some patients attempted to return to the hospital, running directly into the flames. Others either fought with the rescuers or attempted to run away from them. Some people tried to hide in closets or under the beds, whilst others simply hid under their bed sheets. For years, those patients had lived a very simple life in one building. Many of those from the second and third floor hadn't even been allowed to leave their rooms. This was literally their entire world, and they had gotten used to rules that they lived by up to that point. Now their routine was being disturbed, and they simply didn't know how to react. One of the nurses would later say in an interview, they didn't want to leave, especially those who had been there for years and knew that they weren't allowed to leave their rooms. Additionally, many of the patients were scared of the unfamiliar people in strange masks barging into their rooms. Allegedly, many of them thought that the war had begun again. Eventually, in a desperate bid to calm the patients down, someone suggested that the firefighters try wearing hospital gowns over their uniforms. Strangely, this strategy worked, and the patients finally stopped trying to resist their rescuers. Even the patients that would be rescued from the fire presented a problem. Many of them started wandering off into the night, wearing nothing but charred pajamas, or in some cases, nothing at all. A local militia had to be mobilized to try and track down these patients before they froze to death. As time passed, many bystanders began to gather at the scene. These people weren't there to help, they just wanted to watch. Their presence significantly complicated an already challenging operation. The bystanders obstructed paths for vehicles and emergency personnel, which made it very difficult for the rescuers to assess the situation. Eventually, tanker trucks and additional firefighters with specialized equipment arrived at the scene. By this point, the roof of the hospital had collapsed, trapping many people underneath burning rubble. By 4 a.m, the fire was extinguished. As the flames died down, the full extent of the tragedy wasn't immediately obvious. The hospital staff were under the impression that they'd successfully saved almost everybody. It was only when the firefighters went into the building and searched through the scorched wreckage that they saw the true scale of the tragedy. In many of the rooms, notably those on the third floor, they saw charred bodies with their hands desperately clutching the metal bars of their windows. Some of the victims were found on their beds, tied to the grotesquely warped frames, or curled up underneath. Others were crammed into the corners. The temperature on that floor had been so immense that their bodies had cracked open, revealing the insides. One firefighter later said, "I remember a moment when I said, 'Someone is lying there but he has two heads.' It's a strange thing because the exposed, burned liver resembled a skull." By the morning, all the patients who had wandered off were found, and all the surviving patients were sent to various hospitals in different parts of Poland to receive further care and support. Then began the difficult task of removing the bodies from the wreckage. A total of 55 people had died in the fire. The firefighters completely refused to come back. The local firefighters had all been volunteers, and the fire brigades from neighbouring towns saw this as being out of their jurisdiction. The corpse cleanup was left to those who had no choice in the matter, the military reservists. Reportedly, many of the servicemen were so overwhelmed by what they found on the third floor that they were unable to hold back their tears, and many of them experienced intense panic attacks. For the patients of Górna Grupa, their struggles continued even after the fire was extinguished. They had faced not only physical and emotional trauma, but also the loss of their home, and with it their sense of identity. This was best exemplified by the response of one patient who, when asked about his name upon admission to a new hospital, said, "I have no name. It burned down in the fire." The nurses later recounted numerous instances where they were recognised by their former patients. These patients desperately wanted to return home. They seemed completely unaware or unable to accept that their home was gone. Those who died in the fire were buried in a mass grave marked as NN, from the Latin non notus, name unknown. Local authorities refused to acknowledge the victims, living or dead, in any way. What's more, they actively attempted to suppress the incident to avoid public scrutiny. As with a lot of attempted cover-ups, there were numerous conspiracy theories that sprung up around the event. One conspiracy theory was that some of the patients were actually political prisoners who were deemed inconvenient by the authorities. According to this conspiracy, whilst these individuals were held in the hospital, they were heavily medicated to keep them docile, and the fire was not an accident. It's pretty impossible to know if there's any truth to this theory. It's unlikely that every patient in Górna Grupa was a political prisoner, but it is true that during that time, authorities did use psychiatric hospitals as a means to confine and silence individuals who they deemed inconvenient to the regime. It's also worth noting that the communist authorities kept the names of 9 out of the 55 victims strictly confidential, and they destroyed all the relevant documents, making sure that their identities will forever remain unknown, so make of that what you will. Soon after the incident, an investigation was launched to determine the cause of the fire and to identify who was responsible for it. Initially, suspicions were directed towards the trustworthy patient, Ali, the known pyromaniac, but they found no evidence that he had done it. The Deputy Director for Economic and Financial Affairs and also the head of the Administrative and Economic Department were accused of neglecting standards. This carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison, and their trial began in the autumn of 1981. Shortly after this, Poland experienced political turmoil and martial law was declared. This led to the case being postponed, and eventually in 1984 it was dismissed under an amnesty. The 4 nurses who were in charge of the hospital the night that the fire started were accused of gross neglect. However, they too were covered by the 1984 amnesty and their case was dropped. Ultimately, no one was ever sentenced over the fire. According to official findings, the cause of the fire was a spark from a faulty chimney flue that somehow made its way into the space between the walls and ignited the insulation material. Some sources claim that the patients had been reporting that the walls felt warm and they'd been smelling the faint smell of smoke for days before the incident. But in a place where many people hear voices or see things that aren't really there, such warnings carried little weight and they were ignored. According to experts, the fire could have been smouldering inside the walls for several days before the full ignition occurred. The Górna Grupa hospital was never reopened for medical use. In 1989, the Verbite missionaries returned to their monastery and began rebuilding once again. Today, the building serves as a residence for the retired missionaries, providing them with a peaceful place to spend their remaining days. In 2010, the Verbite Word missionaries funded a commemorative plaque that bears the names of the 44 known patients who perished in the fire. In response to the tragedy, a very famous Polish poet and singer named Jacek Kaczmarski wrote a song about the incident. The song's lyrics are a dramatic retelling of the events of the fire, but at the same time many see it as a metaphor for the oppressive communist regime and a critique of a society that doesn't rebel against it. In English, the song title translates as, "And we don't want to escape from here." So that's the story of the Górna Grupa hospital fire. I hope you found it interesting. I'm not sure if many people in the English speaking world have heard about it. I certainly hadn't, so I'm glad to be able to bring it to you. Thank you for watching, and as always, thank you to the patrons who are helping to support the channel. Thank you very much. Until next time, goodbye. Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here.